we're going to talk about today does not have a clear institutional home. It's work that supports food security, ag productivity, resilience, climate change adaptation, and even definitely elements of innovation. And this particular R4 project that we're going to talk about today has been the recipient of a funding award from our Development Innovation Ventures Fund at USAID. So it hits a lot of boxes, but it doesn't have a clear institutional home. That said, it really speaks to some of the issues we want to address in this adaptation community. It's about managing climate risk and helping people have as many integrated methods to manage that risk as possible, and not just having one tool for managing risk, but having multiple tools for managing risk that work together. And when I first heard about R4, I was trying to think about kind of how it all worked together, and I said, well, what do all the pieces work together? How does that work? And then I realized the beauty of R4 is that there are many complementary pieces that self-reinforce each other. And it speaks to the importance of a comprehensive approach to managing a lot of the challenges that we have, especially when it comes to climate risk, because usually climate risk is wrapped up with a number of other development challenges. And we can't go in and often just only address the climate risk, because that's not necessarily the most relevant thing for what people are struggling with, especially in places where people are very much living on the margin. We need to be able to address the ensemble of risks that people are facing, but also keep in mind how climate affects those risks and is affected by those risks. So we're going to talk about the Rural Resilience Initiative, which is working in Senegal and Ethiopia and also expanding, and I'll let Richard talk a little bit more about that. I'm very excited about this. I just came back from a 2-week field visit in Senegal, where I got a chance to see this project on the ground. The work in Senegal is being funded by the Global Climate Change Office. It's an investment we've had over the last couple of years in partnership with WFP. So let me introduce Richard specifically. Richard Choularton is the Chief of Climate and Disaster Risk Reduction Programs at the World Food Program. And so he links the engagement on climate change and disaster risk reduction. And Richard also reminded me that he represents the World Food Program at the UNFCCC climate change negotiations, and is heavily involved in the discussions around loss and damage and the UN system's response to that. So his work is developing innovative risk management solutions that target the most vulnerable and food insecure populations. He spent a lot of time thinking about issues around emergency preparedness, risk financing, resilience, food security, and disaster risk reduction. And he's worked at WFP for a number of years in a number of different capacities. And prior to WFP, he also worked for USAID's Famine Early Warning Systems Network, for those of you who are familiar with that project. It's a long-going investment in the early warning around famine and food security. So, Richard, we'll turn it over to you to talk about the R4, and we'll look forward to your questions afterwards.
Thanks very much, Andre. I like the bit where you were explaining R4, but you can keep going if you want. If you excuse me, I'm going to stand up because I've been talking all day. It'll be easier for me to stay awake. It's great to be here this afternoon and talk to you about R4, especially from an adaptation perspective. Andre mentioned that I used to work for FuseNet, the Famine Early Warning Systems. When I first got interested in climate change, when you work for FuseNet, you watch the climate very carefully. It's also a great place to learn about the climate. There's some really fantastic technical partners at NASA, NOAA, and USGS helping to understand the links between climate, agriculture, food security, and livelihoods. And at that time, we started to see some really of Africa and the Sahel. We started to see in pastoral areas between 7 and 9 years of rainfall below 300 millimeters a year, which is the minimum threshold for viable pasture regeneration. We started to look at long-term climate data sets and see things like a 2 millimeter per year decrease in precipitation over key producing areas in Ethiopia. And when combined with things like population growth and environmental degradation, and many other factors, we started to see protracted food security crises that manifested themselves in very severe food security outcomes, malnutrition rates that are well into the emergency thresholds every year seasonally, and when there was a shock, a major crisis emerging. And so one of the things I took away from that was, okay, first of all, we've got to get much better at translating all of our knowledge about climate and food security into action. Our early warning's gotten a lot better, but our ability to respond to it hasn't in the same way. And that there are fundamental long-term processes going on that are going to result in very serious food security problems unless we find a way to change the dynamic. And then when I went to WFP to start looking at climate change from WFP's perspective, those questions weighed quite heavily on my mind. The World Food Programme is the largest humanitarian organization in the world. We provide emergency assistance and other food assistance to 100 million people a year in 75 countries. And most of the work that people know us for is our emergency response, our work in conflict and major natural disasters. But a significant amount of our work has always been trying to help communities reduce the risks that they face, prepare better for disasters, and build their long-term food security. And in that context, we started looking at insurance and other private sector mechanisms to manage risk 10 years ago to try and get a better set of tools for responding effectively, especially to climate shocks. And we tried different things like weather index insurance, risk financing at the national level. And for smallholder farmers, we found out, okay, you can insure farmers at least once, and they may buy it once if you do a good job marketing. And that could be a useful tool, but the kind of people that we work with couldn't afford it. They're too poor to pay insurance premiums, which, especially if they're commercially priced, are quite expensive. And in any case, insurance by itself is not an effective tool. It has to be bundled with something else. The traditional wisdom is that's credit or input supply. But it has to be somehow combined with an opportunity to earn a better livelihood or more income. Otherwise, the investment in insurance doesn't make so much sense. We were about to shut down our micro-insurance pilots because of that until we came across a small program in Ethiopia that Oxfam America and Swiss Re and a national NGO, REST, had started, where they had tried to sell insurance to farmers, and the farmers in the community, or one of the farmers in the community said, oh, that's a really interesting idea. I could see that might be useful. I can't pay for it. Can I work for it? And Oxfam said, okay. Those farmers work in the Productive Safety Net program in Ethiopia, which is a program that provides assistance to about 8 million Ethiopians who are food insecure. They work on community infrastructure, soil and water conservation activities in exchange for food or cash. And they were then given the opportunity to work extra days on community disaster risk reduction activities in exchange for an insurance policy. And in the first year, 200 farmers signed up. In the second year, 1,300 farmers signed up. And we said, okay, this could be an interesting thing to test. So let's hold off closing down all this work on insurance, and let's see if this idea of insurance for work can make a difference. And R4 was born from there. So I'd like to kind of explain a little bit how it works, maybe talk a little bit about it as an adaptation approach, and then tell you some of the things that we've found in our learning so far. Okay, so as I mentioned, the idea was to bring different things together. I'll just skip that, and I want to sort of try and illustrate to you what that means. So if you look at the squiggly lines, most food insecure people in rural areas are farmers. They plant a crop, they harvest it. After the harvest, they've got enough food for at least a little while. After some months, they start to run out of food. They face a seasonal food deficit where they can't meet all of their needs, so they reduce their consumption and expenditure, and they face what we call a seasonal food deficit or shortage during the hunger season. And that's a pattern we find all over the world. And many government safety nets and many WFP programs are designed to fill that seasonal food gap so that people can focus on building their livelihood and doing other things rather than searching for food or selling assets. When a drought hits, the impact is significant. The food deficit is deeper, comes faster. Households are forced to pull their kids out of school, sell their assets, reduce consumption, migrate in search of labor, split the family up. And the impacts last for a long time. The impact isn't over next time you harvest. Our analysis, for example, of trend data over 10 years in Niger shows that it takes 3 years for the most food insecure households to recover basic levels of consumption and stop distress coping after a drought. Three years to recover after a drought. And quite often there'll be another shock. It may not be a drought, maybe a flood, maybe a price shock, maybe something else during that time. And as a result, we see places with progressive processes of destitution and livelihood decline. And those were the things that we were picking up in FuseNet, and the things that climate change is making worse. And so we tried to design R4 as a series of risk management tools that comes together to help break that cycle and help people start to begin to build a climate resilient livelihood so that they can get to the point where they can start to adapt. Many of these households face an adaptation deficit. They can't deal with their current level of climate risk. Being able to adapt to something that's viable in a new riskier climate is a non-starter if you can't deal with the current level of climate risk. So with R4, we really started to focus on how to improve the quality of the disaster risk reduction work that's done at the local level in safety nets. Focus more on higher quality soil and water conservation, irrigation systems, look very closely in communities at the relationship between climate risk and food security outcomes, and identify the kinds of activities that will most reduce the impact of climate shocks on people's food security. So that when a drought does hit, its impact is a lot less. Many of these people live in highly degraded environments. 80% of the world's food insecure people live in countries that have high levels of environmental degradation. 80% of the world's food insecure people live in highly degraded lands. So just a small amount of variability in climate can translate into a major shock on crop production and livelihood. So first was really focus on that, and that will reduce the impact. Add to that insurance so that when a shock does occur, people are able to meet their basic needs, repay their loans, invest in seeds and inputs for the next season, and keep building their livelihoods despite those climate shocks. And this mechanism of allowing people to work for insurance allowed us to get insurance to the households who needed it the most, and accelerate the amount of community risk reduction work that can be done. And that's in comparison to our programming before, where we would work on disaster risk reduction activities. We would help people recover from a shock, but then there would be another shock, and they would drop back down to where we started, and we would go through a cycle with them for a long period of time and not really achieve anything. And in fact, because of increasing climate risk, we would see worsening conditions. With that foundation, we then also worked to improve access to credit, livelihoods diversification, and savings or risk reserves, prudent risk taking, so that people could start to build other sources of income and food that were non-climate sensitive. One of the things that we do as we're looking at where to implement this kind of program is we take people's household food and income and expenditure data, and we break it down by climate and non-climate sensitive to see where people are food insecure and poor, and also have high levels of exposure to climate risk, and to try and find the place where those are most strongly linked, and how we can then help them become less sensitive to climate shocks. So that's the model. Try and first reduce the risk, protect investments in livelihoods with insurance, allow people to take credit, build up savings, diversify their livelihoods. And the 4 R's are risk reduction, risk transfer, risk taking, and risk reserves. We couldn't come up with a very exciting name, so we wrote that on top of the original design document, and it just stayed there. So what have we done so far? As I said, we started with 200 households and then 1,300 households in Ethiopia. The next year it scaled up to 13,000, the next year 19,000, 25,000, and this year 30,000 in Ethiopia. We've expanded to Senegal, where now we're up to 6,000 households in the program with 2,000 insured, and we've just started in Malawi and Zambia. What's, I think, really interesting for us is because we've had now 5 cycles in Ethiopia and a couple of cycles in Senegal, we're starting to see the results. We've had payouts, we see what people do with them, we see what the impact is on people's decision making. And we've just completed an impact evaluation in Ethiopia of the first 4 years. And there are significant differences between insured and uninsured farmers. Insured farmers have 123% more savings, 25% more plow oxen. They invest 25% more in agricultural labor. In one cluster of villages, they had 254% more cereal stocks. Women seem to be benefiting the most. Many female-headed households have stopped sharecropping and are farming their own land. We see increased spending by women on hired labor and oxen. And we also see greater levels of use of improved seeds and inputs by female-headed households. I think the main lesson that we're learning is that the combination of these things, the investment in risk reduction with the protection of insurance, is giving people the confidence to take risk that they wouldn't otherwise take. They increase their investment in inputs and farm more land, knowing that if there's a drought, they will be protected, and they won't have to pull their kids out of school. They're willing to pay school fees ahead of time and not be conservative if they think it's going to be a bad year, and that's resulting in these kind of impacts the question really we have to focus on now is, as we start to see these improvements, do we also see a transition to a livelihood system that's resilient against the future climate that these households will face? And that's a big question that we're going to start trying to look at, especially in countries where we're starting the baseline process fresh, like Malawi and Zambia. Senegal was our second country. We don't have yet the same kind of results. The end of this year, we hope to have the first impact evaluation from Senegal. But we are learning some important things about insurance and gender and financial access that I'll touch on briefly, and then we can. I will talk one more thing about pastoralists, and then we can open up the floor for discussion. So there's always a lot of interest in insurance, and especially in how you foster private sector insurance markets that are sustainable, but also accessible to the people who need it the most. And one of the things that we're finding is that there has to be a greater business case for local insurance companies for them to really make sustained investments in developing and delivering products. And what we've been doing in Senegal is trying to crowd in other commercial insurance products into our distribution mechanisms. Delivery channels are a real problem. Most insurance companies in developing countries do property, casualty, car insurance, health, life insurance in cities. They don't have an expansive network in rural areas, and they cannot cover the covariate risks like drought. You know, if you have a drought insurance policy, you pay all your clients at the same time. So you've got to have a lot of money in the bank to be able to do that. Their balance sheets are not big enough. Their access to reinsurance is not always great. So trying to help them solve those problems with, on one hand, access to reinsurance, on the other hand, helping use distribution channels, in our case, like safety net systems, and then using that to crowd in other products that they can offer seems to strengthen the business case. One of the things that we're finding too is that when you try to develop an agricultural insurance product and sell it by itself, it's very difficult to explain, especially when you're using things like satellite data as your trigger for a payout. It's a difficult thing to explain. It's a difficult thing to explain to me. But when it's presented in the context of a more comprehensive risk management process that's developed through a community engagement process, it makes a lot more sense. And so that's, I think, an important lesson for all this discussion about what to do with insurance and climate change. Is it has to be part of something bigger. It has to be linked with efforts to reduce risk and also help people build their livelihoods and just protect them. We've seen really good results in Ethiopia and Senegal around gender. In Senegal, we've seen increased access to land, seeds, and water for irrigation and drinking because of the project, and that has to do with the community risk reduction work and its impact on the use of land for agriculture and available water. Because of the investment in financial education, particularly around how to manage savings, we see better numeracy, literacy, and business skills being developed. Because of the reduced labor burden that comes from the DRR work and water availability, women have more time to dedicate to children and small businesses. And in general, women have more confidence in their ability to feed their kids, pay their school fees, and earn more money through crop sales that are less variable. And that's come from a lot of focus on making sure there's equal participation in community planning process, which is good development practice, and then trying to identify the specific activities that will have the most impact on men and women in terms of supporting their components of the family's livelihoods activity. Financial access. We've seen, and it's funny for a kind of adaptation resilience product to really plug into financial inclusion discussions, but we've seen this attempt to link insurance as a risk management tool with credit and savings as really identifying an unmet demand for formal financial services. And by having those basic tools in place, much more willingness by people to take on formal financial tools like credit. And we see in Senegal, the way that we do the savings component is through a village level savings groups of 10 women or men who come together to save and then lend out to each other or others. And those groups have become critical vehicles for linking to formal finance. We also see that those savings are allowing people to invest. So men are particularly investing in agricultural equipment, but women in petty trade. So that's one interesting difference, is that those petty trade activities are non-climate sensitive. So over time, what we hope to see is that dynamic grow and people grow their income from those non-climate sensitive sources of food and income. We did a study in Mali where we found in the mid-Sahelian band of Mali, the most food insecure people relied exclusively on livestock and agriculture for their food and income, sorghum and millet production usually. But after the 1970s climate shift in the Sahel, they went from having 2 viable sorghum and millet harvests every 3 years to 1. Whereas better off people in those communities had at least 4 sources of food and income, and half of them were non-climate sensitive, petty trade or something else. And so a group of people had been able to adapt out of risky agriculture, and a group of people had not, and those who had not were the most food insecure, and those who had were better off. So we hope to see kind of a change in that dynamic for the food insecure households we're helping. Okay, one last slide, and then it will be great to have a discussion. I mentioned at the beginning that we saw these really troubling patterns in pastoral areas of the Horn of Africa. And one thing that we're doing now is trying to take this model of bringing together these different risk management tools and apply it to pastoralists. And there's a much different combination of tools within the approach. So for example, we're developing an insurance product that pays early when the pasture starts to fail, so that households can have access to emergency feed and veterinary care and prevent livestock deaths. It costs 16 to 17 times more to replace a cow than it does to prevent its death in a drought. We're linking that in with climate information and climate services that help pastoralists better manage their trekking. So if you're a pastoralist moving your sheep, goats, camels, and cows around the range, you send out scouts to look for good grazing and water. And when the scout comes back, you decide what to do. And it takes the scout quite a long time sometimes to go and check things out. And you don't know the condition of your different grazing areas when you send them out. And that results in a delay and then more stress on the animals. And if you make a wrong decision about where to send your animals, they have even more stress. So we've taken data on vegetation from the Ethiopian National Early Warning System, and we've overlaid that with a community mapping process where specific clans map out their traditional grazing areas, and then every 10 days they get a printout of the vegetation conditions in their grazing areas, not their neighboring clans' grazing areas, just theirs. And what they have done is they either decide where to send a scout. If they send their cattle and camels, which are more valuable, they send a scout to check it out first. If they're sending their sheep and goats who are a bit more hardy, they just send them. And in the first year of doing that, in Ethiopia, in the communities where we worked with Project Concern International, livestock mortality on tracking dropped by 47%. That's 8 million in avoided losses, just for one or two communities. And so we're bringing together this kind of climate service with insurance, risk reduction activities, and then also better market access to try and see if we can make this work in a very, very different context. So that's just, I guess, a starter, and then maybe we can open the floor to a discussion, to questions.
Hello, my name is Aram and I work for CCAP. Thank you, Richard. Good to
Hi,
see
Aram.
you again. Fascinating experience with the pastoral areas. All I knew was the experience at AgriMap, overlaying NDVI for pastoralists. I think of 7. Any plans to expand that?
Yeah. Yeah, you know, there've been a few examples. There was a fairly long-standing program in Karamoja also to use NDVI more as a conflict resolution tool than as a risk management tool that was quite successful. Yes, we've just started a plan with Project Concern to expand it to other areas of Ethiopia and possibly other countries. The evidence from the first pilot it's initial. You know, those are back of the envelope calculations. The mortality data is pretty good, but it's only a few communities, and the difference between communities was significant. So what we want to do is try and expand it to more places, and then do much more rigorous evaluation on how it works and why it works, and how it can be improved. But I mean, you're the champion for really finding ways to give farmers and pastoralists climate information, and then they're great risk managers if it's in the right format that's defined by them. They really are able to use it, and that's what you see here, I think.
Hi, I'm Michael Cody from Agility Corporation. Thanks for a very nice talk. I have two questions. One is in regards to the squiggly line that you presented earlier. I'm wondering if you can go to the second to last squiggly line slide. Is this one?
This one, yeah.
So I'm wondering if, so this was your insurance, right?
Yeah.
Is it dependent upon whatever happens here? Like, is there some type of decision point that
No.
triggers this insurance to come in here?
No, so the risk reduction just reduces the impact of the drought. I mean, so that's the insurance itself, or depending on what kind of insurance is triggered by something specific. In our case, it's almost exclusively weather index insurance. So we work with community insurance design teams and local ag extension agents to look at rainfall data, temperature data, crop yield statistics, and then try and come up with a good relationship between one of those variables, usually rainfall, but it doesn't have to be, and loss and yield loss. And then that index becomes the trigger for the payout. You can access the insurance in two ways in our program. You can pay in cash, full price. You can pay in cash, and if you're a participant in one of our programs or in Ethiopia the National Safety Net program, you're given the option to work for the insurance, and the work goes to that disaster risk reduction activity. So if you don't do the risk reduction activity, you don't get the insurance policy. But then the insurance policy is triggered by the index.
Great, thanks. And then the second question is, have you noticed in your assessments any behavior changes in men? So if women, if their capacity rises and they're getting more money, do the men come in and say, you know, actually that's my money? They start taking over the farming or something. Do you see something like that? I asked because we saw that in a project that we ran in Senegal, but it wasn't a climate program, it was a supply chain, but the capacity went up. That was one of the effects.
I don't think so. I'm not saying that hasn't happened, but there's nothing in the evaluations in Ethiopia that shows that happened, and those benefits are for women-headed households. So I don't know, Fabio, have you seen anything in Senegal?
Okay. In Senegal, what's happening is that we haven't, there are different products for in the project. We are not excluding, it's not a project for women. So it's not only women that getting benefits, but we are trying, there are benefits for men also. So we haven't seen that pattern because women have their activities, they engage in savings, but the men also have their own benefits. So we haven't really seen, in fact, we have seen that women feel much more empowered. They actually gain more and they feel they have more control over those resources because the men also have their own benefits. So the men have the insurance, they gain from that, and so there is no competition really between the things. It's not a project that is directed at women. You see, I think we have highlighted the impacts on the women because they are there and they've been able to keep those gains for themselves.
That's really great, thanks.
Is there a question?
Hi, I'm Lori Ashley. I'm an independent consultant. This presentation is so exciting. I'm really impressed by the program, and the results are really impressive. And so, of course, my questions are about replicability and sustainability, and you referenced that in terms of the difficulties of involving private sector insurance companies and this sort of thing. But if we have this level of results, I'm wondering about the role for continued development assistance or the role of government in something like this, or what do you see as the future of this program? Does it ultimately involve more private sector involvement? Is it something where governments need to play more of a role?
Yes, and yes.
Yeah. and the challenge, I mean, all of it has challenges associated with it. So.
Yeah, no, it's that's the billion-dollar question in a sense. This program isn't meant to help 30 or 40 or 50,000 people. This has to scale up to millions of people if it's going to be successful. There are a number of reasons for that. One is the level of need. The other is the fact that you can't have a viable insurance market without a certain level of scale. And so if we're going to get to the point where we have cost-effective agricultural insurance to help people manage risks, it has to have millions of farmers signed up. To get from here to there is a long road. The sustainability question for us has two really big parts. One is for us, first and foremost, this is about the cost-effective use of government and donor resources for social protection and safety nets. So, for example, WFP has anywhere between 15 and 30 million people a year working in food and cash for assets programs, and it's kind of the foundation programs that these are built on. The government of Ethiopia spends $400 million a year to support 8 million people in its safety net. That's had a tremendous development impact in Ethiopia. There are 375 million people in Latin America in labor-based public works programs, 100 million people in Ethiopia. So governments are already putting huge amounts of resources into helping poor people to meet their basic needs and build assets and do public works. And for us, the question is, how do you make those more effective, especially given the increasing levels of climate risk? And then also, how do you use those as platforms for large-scale concrete adaptation on the ground? So what you see is climate risk undermining that investment. You spend that amount of money to support 8 million people in Ethiopia, and you don't deal with the combination of environmental degradation and increasing climate risk, you're going to have a bigger problem later. And we see households graduate, the next year there's a shock, they're back in the program, they keep recycling. So how do we help them really graduate and put them on a trajectory towards really building a thriving, resilient livelihood? So that for us is the core question around sustainability, is how do we make those kind of programs more effective and a vehicle for adaptation. The second part of the sustainability question is we know we need large-scale private sector involvement, both as the insurance party in a national program. Don't forget, 80% of agricultural insurance in the developed world is subsidized. And so already there's a critical public-private sector link in viable insurance markets in developed countries. That's likely to be the need in developing countries. In Asia, for example, there are very large subsidized national insurance programs. But also so that you have insurance companies offering products to people who can pay. And so in R4, we've always offered the products to cash-paying farmers. 10 to 20% every year of the farmers do pay cash. We're learning a lot about why and who and what makes that successful. But eventually, if you graduate from the program, you should still be able to access insurance. So you should still be able to buy protection if you need it, which you probably do if you're a farmer. And so we've got to have both the public sector market working, but you've also got to have a private sector market that people with a bit more resources can access. And if you don't see that working in tandem, it's not as sustainable. That depends. What's the cost? It depends. Depends where. It's quite different from Senegal to Ethiopia. First of all, in Senegal, 50% of all ag insurance is subsidized by the government. So that makes it a lot cheaper. And there, the design process with communities has focused on a policy that protects basic food security. So the payouts are smaller. So they work 5 to 7 days. It's $5 to $7. It's not very much for a coverage that's about 1 in 7, well, 1 in 6 in terms of years payouts. In Ethiopia, farmers have asked for higher price, more frequent payouts. Because they face such a high level of climate risk, and there's such a lack of other risk management options that they're willing to work and pay more. They also value the assets that they're building quite a lot, so you're not just working for the insurance, you're working for the irrigation system or the composting pit or the terrace. And there, it's between $17 and $22, so 17, 22 days more or less, which is quite substantial. And that's for a 1 in 4 or 5 policy if you work 24 days, and a 1 in 5, 6 year policy. So that has a quite frequent payout. And that, if you're an insurance person, you will inevitably go, that's really not the way it's supposed to be. But that's the way that farmers have said they want it. And they appreciate much more the value of that in a broader package. You know, if they didn't have that, they wouldn't be able to take credit without worrying about repayment during a drought. They wouldn't get the same level of investment in their land. So, and that's one thing we're also quite interested to see in terms of climate change. As people become more resilient, will they opt for less costly insurance that pays less frequently? And also, what will happen to the pricing of insurance as climate risk goes up? And already, you know, the pricing of our insurance is actuarially fair. In other words, it's the probability of payout divided by the maximum payout. So if you get $100 and you're going to pay once every 10 years, your premium's $10. Plus what's called an uncertainty load. So the insurers take into account the uncertainty related to poor data. It's a very data poor environment, so it's not 100% clear whether or not your data is a reflection of reality, and the uncertainties associated with climate change over a longer period of time. And that's one thing that insurance companies really like about what we're doing, is if you just sell insurance, then you know that the risk is going to go up because of climate change. But if you're investing in risk reduction and reducing the baseline exposure to those risks, then you're a much better insurance customer, because your losses will be reduced over the long term.
So, yeah, congratulations on the success of getting this up and running. My name's Kevin Brown from Winrock International. One question I have is, have there been any discussion of using these insurance schemes as a means to actually change farmer behavior, not just in terms of their risk to climate stressors, but also other co-benefits, other ecosystem services, or maybe incorporating this into like a payment for ecosystem services kind of scheme as well?
There's a lot of discussion about the influence on behavior and risk management alone, especially given that we're focused on weather insurance, but even if you're in a place that has a high risk of a weather hazard, you have other hazards as well, and so you have to have a more robust risk management framework to deal with those. So it's no good if you spend all this time trying to deal with weather hazards and then a pest comes and destroys your crop. That's not helpful. We haven't looked at payment for ecosystems services yet. Maybe that could be something to do. In Zambia, we are looking at linking the conditionality for insurance, in other words, what you have to do to get it, to conservation agriculture practices and climate smart agriculture practices. That will be the first time we've really tried to go beyond sort of labor-intensive risk reduction works into more ag practices, and that will be an interesting experiment. We've looked at it for community emergency preparedness as well. So we've looked at, for example, providing an insurance voucher if you participate in a community emergency preparedness training and you complete your household preparedness plan or your evacuation plan for floods and storms. So if you do that, then you get a voucher which, if there's a hurricane or a flood, you can go and turn in at your local store, and you can pick up food or whatever else that you need. But we haven't tested that one yet.
Peter Cocapelli from Climate Decision. I had two questions. One, you talked about that uncertainty factor, and I was curious how big that was in the example you gave, if there's a $10 premium. And also, right now, since you have a relatively small pool, are your risks, do they tend to be correlated? That is, if you were more geographically diverse, then you wouldn't necessarily have all your big payouts in 1 year. I noticed you had one big payout. Was that because you had an event that was hitting a relatively small pilot project?
Yeah, so no, the most of the pricing really is determined by reinsurers. Reinsurers will explain to you what they take into account, but they will not let you see the math. Usually, that's a trade secret. We reckon it's about 20% when you add everything up, but it's variable, and it also takes into account starting conditions. So, for example, if there's a El Nino forecast that's high, your price is going to be higher because the risk of drought is higher. If there isn't, it will be lower. So that and it's also, the climate change signal versus the other parts of the uncertainty are very difficult to disentangle. The better data we have, the better climate data we have, the less the uncertainty load is, and so that's one priority always for us is better data, so we can assess the risk more and price the risk more effectively. With drought, really, I think the diversification of the pool needs to be over larger geographical areas. The small payouts have been essentially localized differences in rainfall. They haven't been strong signal droughts. When there is a strong signal drought, like 2012 in northern Ethiopia, typically everybody gets gets hit. So you can't diversify your pool unless you're really talking about Ethiopia and Senegal and Guatemala and the Philippines. And that's where we really, I think, need to go to have an effective global insurance market around drought. If we look at that as one portfolio, there are about 50 to 75 drought microinsurance transactions in Africa every year now. So there's a growing market. Most of them are small, but there's a growing market. You'll tend to have regions that are affected, but not all regions at the same time. So that allows some diversification. But the volumes, I mean, the amount of money we're talking about in comparison to the capacity of the global reinsurance market are minuscule, especially given that there's a huge amount of capital in the global insurance markets that's underutilized at the moment. So there's a lot of capacity to take risk. That's why you see the cat bond market, for example, exploding at the moment. And we're not actually using that capacity at the moment. So hopefully we'll get our millions of farmers and use the capacity a bit more effectively in the future.
Thank you.
Rose Schneider, Health Systems Management. I wanted to ask, you mentioned Plan International and another NGO.
Project Concern.
Project Concern. Could you talk a little bit about what their roles were and how that would be sustainable if they didn't stay as partners with the project?
Sure, and it wasn't planned. So R4 is an equal partnership with Oxfam International, Oxfam America, sorry, and Oxfam's role has been the innovator. You know, it was their program that came up with the idea. We teamed up with them to take that innovation and try and get it to scale. Their vision is really to help us and others see that innovation rigorously tested and scaled up. So that's one important role. And we talk a lot, both in the climate change discussions and the resilience discussions, about the need for new kinds of partnerships and working together and bringing civil society and public and private sectors together. You see very few practical examples of how that works. And what we found is that rather than just trying to do it ourselves, working at that global level with an NGO partner like Oxfam has been a tremendous learning experience for both of us, and we've been much stronger together. So that role of convening civil society and UN and government together is a stronger partnership than alone. At the practical level, every place is different, and you see, I mean, I think a few things happening. One is much stronger government ownership of their development and adaptation programming and social protection programming, especially with the emergence of more middle-income countries. So you see a stronger presence of government, particularly at local level, than before, and that has to be, a major part of how we work. But you also see an explosion of civil society, both international and national civil society organizations working to solve problems on the ground, and I don't see that as unsustainable. The civil society engagement in general. R4 has 26 partners in Ethiopia and about the same number in Senegal, ranging from community organizations to national NGOs to national government institutions, international institutions, and donors. And it wouldn't work if we didn't have that constellation working together. So although one institution may have a program in a certain number of years and then move on to the next one, there'll always be local partners, international, national, public sector working. And what we've really focused on is trying to link community and mid-meso level planning that brings those partners together in a coherent way. You often have good national strategies and plans, and you often have great community-based plans, especially where you have strong civil society presence. But there's often a missing middle, you know, like to borrow a phrase from microfinance. There's often little capacity or planning at the municipal or district level that's bringing together particularly state institution and larger civil society institutions in a way that then supports the implementation of those community plans in a coherent way. So what we've done in R4 is really tried to focus on making that mid-level planning process work to bring 20 plus partners together so that everybody knows their piece, when they're going to do it, that they're sequenced and complementary. Because we talk about complementary programming all the time, but how do you deliver it? That's a real operational challenge, especially when you have so many actors to coordinate. So yeah, I think that's sustainable. I think it's very healthy.
Hi, thanks a lot for organizing this presentation. And I think you talked about this a bit in your answer to the last question and in the presentation. But I'd like to ask about kind of bridging that gap to, I'm Alex Dunkel from ACDI Boca. Thank you. About bridging that gap to those communities that there's no incentive for those insurance companies to make the effort to go into those communities. So I'd like to know about the entry points to those communities. Who have you used? Have there been community groups or maybe private input dealers and suppliers that can be utilized to sell these insurance packages? I think you touched upon this a bit, but
yeah, well, you're not going to get an insurance company to develop and offer a highly specialized technical product they've never dealt with in a rural community 10 hours drive away from the capital unless they perceive there's a market. That's basic. And in agricultural insurance, there won't be you don't just don't start offering it. So there has to be at least a process of putting in place the basic infrastructure required to deliver insurance, particularly things like data, distribution channels. Yeah, it could be input dealers, could be co-ops, could be microfinance institutions. In our case, it's the safety net infrastructure. And then you have to find a way to generate demand. Our hypothesis that we're testing is that by using the demand of insurance for work, we will be able to generate enough of a market that we start making insurance commercially available to other farmers. We start building the capacity of farmers to pay for that insurance, and then generate a larger market that can be sustained, or at least if we prove successfully that it makes safety nets cheaper, that will sustain the investment, and then the private sector will have a market that it will dig its teeth into. Again, 80% of ag insurance in the developed world is subsidized. And it's subsidized for very good reasons. And the question is, how do you, as a government, make the best use of your resources? And so some programs you see are very effective, others you see are not very efficient, and there's a lot of work to do to try and help governments get it right. Even if you have the products, the demand side is also important. And so one of the things that we've done in R4 that's maybe different from standard agricultural insurance practice, where normally someone goes and takes loss data and weather data and designs an index, and then somebody tries to market what's been designed by insurance experts, is we form village insurance design teams. We work with farmers in those villages to design the product, to integrate it into their livelihood system and farming practice. So for example, if you grow a long cycle crop and there's a late start to the season and you lose the crop that you planted, if you have the resources, you might be able to switch to a short cycle crop. And if you can do that, you don't lose the whole crop. You may produce less, but you got something. And so our insurance products typically cover loss during the early part of the season, and then drought at the end of the season. So you're able to cover both of those windows and provide people with security to replant. And that I think is a really good way to start building up confidence and trust in products that are otherwise quite difficult to understand.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Another one. I'm just curious about the mechanics of it when you go into a village. So they work for insurance. How does that process actually work?
How does that process work?
Operationally? What's being offered for farmers? Let's say when you go.
So there's a planning process at the mid and community level which identifies the activities that get done, and so there's a discussion with the community about what kind of things would reduce their risk. That involves ag extension agents, other people. A plan gets drawn up. We'll do a terrace here, some stone buns there, a compost pit there. That gets translated into a certain number of days' labor. Like, it takes 10 days to do 5 meters of irrigation ditch per person. And then you work with the community to implement those activities. You count the results, translate them into number of days, and then that gets turned into the value, either food or cash distribution as part of the safety net, or the value of the insurance voucher. So the work is normed, essentially, is what we call it. There's a certain number of days to achieve each output.
John Magistro, a consultant. So if I understand you correctly, this is essentially somewhat of a sort of insurance for work program as opposed to food for work, in the sense that the labor is what is used, compensation, insurance.
It's both, in the sense that people participating in we tend to call it food for assets to focus on the asset build, but food for work or cash for work programs are given the option to work extra days for an insurance policy. So the target population for insurance for work are food insecure households who are participating in those basic safety net programs, and then they work extra days in exchange for the insurance policy. And we've had discussions about whether once you reach a certain level of food security, you can just work for insurance if you don't need the food as a way to protect that gain while you continue to build. We haven't got there.
So if roughly 10, I think you said 10 to 20% of the farmers are actually paying out cash.
Yeah.
So 80, 90% are providing labor.
Yep.
So does that mean then there's a very substantial subsidy then that, these insurance firms could not be viable, right, economically, unless there's a major payment of cash of some sort coming from somewhere, I would assume.
Yeah.
So there's a substantial subsidy then for this, I assume.
Yeah, I'm always I get semantical about whether it's a subsidy or not. the farmer works for it. You know, they work, and we essentially pay them for the work with an insurance voucher, and the work generates an asset. I mean, it results in an output. So yes, somebody has to pay the premium, no doubt. And that's why I said before, the question is, what's the most effective use of government resources in safety nets? If you're providing food and cash for work to millions of people in your safety net program, and you're not getting the result that you need, how do you make that more effective? And so one of the things we're really trying to test is the differential impact of doing a combination of food and cash and insurance versus just doing cash or food.
Okay. And for some of the risk management activities, I assume you're talking about soil, water conservation activities
Typically
in the fields, and then the irrigation, for example. So there must be some capital support to those activities, like the irrigation. Is it small-scale drip, or is it other kind of irrigation? And so there is also a capital input supporting those activities.
Yeah. Yeah. They're typically labor intensive, but there is a capital input requirement. I mean, even if you're doing gabions, you need wire.
This is Lori again. You mentioned the challenges of trying to communicate a program like this, and particularly insurance, to the program participants, which I can imagine. You have a lot of stories about trying how that works, you know. But part of my question is, how much climate change information sharing or climate change adaptation information sharing sort of explicitly, like this is climate change, this is adaptation, this is the uncertainty we're expecting, how much of that is included in the program communications?
Andre told me that I was allowed to do this when I was ready not to answer questions. Yeah, I think that's been a weakness for us. We spent a lot of time initially looking at climate risk and climate change in the design process, and especially in Senegal, we tried to do everything at once. So we tried to have risk reduction and insurance and savings and credit and livelihoods diversification and a series of other things all at once with all 20 partners. And one of the most important operational lessons for us is that's a bad idea. It's too complicated all at once, and things get lost. So now we've taken a step back and started to iteratively layer different pieces of the puzzle on top of each other. You know, get the risk reduction right, add insurance, or start with this. In some places, we start with the savings and then add the risk reduction. And one of the things that we haven't done in trying to sort that out is integrate the climate change discussion back into the community planning process, because we had so much else going on. So that's been a lesson for us in, you know, how do you get to the point where you have something comprehensive enough to work, but in the right way without losing sight of some of the key goals. As Andre said, we don't often have an institutional home because we're trying to deal with so many issues to solve the problem, and then some of them don't get done. In the pastoral pilot, there's a much stronger focus on climate information and working with communities to use and apply climate information, and so hopefully there we'll get that right. I guess everybody's ready for the end of the day.
First of all, I'd like to thank Richard. This is his third presentation of the day, and he's done an excellent job on all of them. So thank him for his Ironman endurance skills today. I think we had a very interesting discussion around a lot of issues about kind of climate in the context of a lot of other development stresses and how we help people manage those risks through a wide variety of tools and some of the challenges in that. And one of the things that I saw out in Senegal is this universe of organizations that are working on this challenge. And there have been some hiccups along the way. They tried one organization to do the public works in the community, and it wasn't the right organization. They had to get another organization. And so one of the things we have to steel ourselves for is kind of the patience to make long-term investments. And Richard, if I might steal your anecdote from this morning, gave a really interesting anecdote experience from Switzerland, which is a place we think of with a lot of capacity, especially in insurance development. And he was talking this morning about how it took 18 years in Switzerland to develop a high-quality hail risk product for farmers. So we have to be realistic about some of the time frames here involved and the kind of longer-term investments that are needed, especially in data. That's a big gap for us. And my colleague, Lena Heron, this morning from the Bureau for Food Security talked a lot about some of the data investments that are needed. And as a climate community, that's the type of investments we should be making. It's not just climate data. That's really important. And in other venues, I've heard Richard talk a lot about the importance of different climate data recovery, a lot of the things that we focus on here. But it's also data on agricultural data. And when we were out working with our projects in Senegal, our food security projects, they're working with the Ministry of Agricultural Statistics. They're trying to improve the data collection, and better data all around increases the accuracy of these products. It buys down the risks, and it makes them more affordable and more sustainable in the long term. So we have a lot of investments to make in those regards as well. Let me conclude with thanking all of you for being here and putting in an advertisement for the next session, which will be held on May 21st, right here, same place. Okay. This is a very different topic. So it's called Science, Religion, and Climate Change in the Amazon, What Indigenous Ecuador Tells Us About the Broader Debate. So obviously a very difficult or different subject. So that's going to focus on the findings of the first comprehensive nationwide surveys on climate change issues and the correlation between religious beliefs and support of climate change efforts in Ecuador. It's a timely topic. I believe the Pope is about to weigh in on climate change topics here very soon. So it should be a very interesting discussion.